Larry Summers made his provocative remarks about the dearth of women in science, the media has gone on about this theory, that theory, yada, yada, yada. But I'm going to jump into the deep water, or maybe get myself into hot water, by giving my 3 theories for why we have so few women in our field planning and scheduling. Theory number 1, women don't like to play with blocks. When we're little girls, our parents give us dolls instead.
Look at the screen! Look at the screen!
Women do like to play with blocks, but they like to play with them when they're 3 years old, and then they realize that it's pretty easy to build just about any tower you can imagine. And when they grow up, they don't want to spend their time getting computers to do it for them. Now, I'll admit that there are a few flaws with these theories, not the least of which is that, Adele's comments notwithstanding, I do think the field has largely moved beyond the blocks world. So let me give a 3rd theory, and it goes something like this. Women in planning and scheduling, and women trying to get into planning and scheduling, like women in just about every male-dominated enterprise, are subject to the inappropriate application of gender schemas, which leads to evaluation bias and an accumulation of disadvantage, which can have negative outcomes that reinforce the original gender schema application. This theory for it as a scientific claim. Number 1, it uses a lot of jargon. Number 2, there's an enormous body of research and evidence behind it. I've already given my tutorial this week. It was on temporal reasoning. I'm not going to give you a tutorial on gender schema. I'm going to real quickly, because otherwise Sam will shoot me or something, give you 3 examples of the kinds of studies I have in mind. Study number 1, the CV study. It's actually CV studies. There's a whole cottage industry of these studies. What a number of researchers have done is taken the CV of a young scientist, manipulated it in one way, changed the name on it. So in English-speaking countries, they make the name be Brian or Karen. In other countries, they use different names. They send them out to faculty in the field that's working in the same field as the person whose CV it is, and they ask for advice. Should we hire this person as an assistant professor? And guess what? People are significantly more likely to say that Brian is qualified to be hired than Karen is, despite the fact that Brian and Karen are the same person. And I should note that there's no difference in the response patterns of men and women. Women are just as likely to prefer Brian to Karen as are men. Study number 2, the picture around the table. You take a picture of a bunch of people sitting around a table, and you ask people, who do you think is the leader of this group? And if it's a single-sex group, if everyone around the table is either male or female, then reliably and almost 100% of the time, people will identify the person at the head of the table. If it's a mixed-sex group and there's a male at the head of the table, then reliably and almost 100% of the time, people will pick the male at the head of the table. If it's a mixed-sex group and there's a female at the head of the table, then about 50% of the time they'll pick the woman, and about 50% of the time they'll pick some random man sitting around the table. This has been replicated over and over. Study number 3, my last one, and I think it's the most compelling because there's no simulation in it. It's, as we say, something that really happened. If you look at symphony orchestras, major symphony orchestras, about 30 years ago, they were very, very heavily dominated by men, almost no women. And then they made one change. They went to blind auditions. They put up a screen so that the person auditioning couldn't be seen by the person listening. And what happened was there was immediately a sizable jump in the number of women who were offered symphony positions. They were 50% more likely to make it out of the preliminary round, and several-fold more likely, if they made it into the second round, to be offered a position. Now, no one thinks that the musical directors are intentionally biased. Everyone believes that they always wanted the best possible musicians. But somehow, they were seeing and hearing the women differently than they were seeing and hearing the men. So at the risk of offending, no wait, I don't have to worry about offending rounds. This is Festivus, right? I'm supposed to offend my friends? So let me just boldly assert that I think it is at least important for members of this community to take a little bit of time to learn about the literature on gender schema, as well as the literature about what you can do to counter it, as it is to learn about the latest graph plan-based heuristic for temporal dynamic oversubscribed planning in uncertain environments. And towards that end, I have a slide with a couple of web pages that I'll put up while I'm taking questions. Thank you.
So Martha, how does this help me get my application papers accepted? That's what I want to do.
Yeah, I know, we all do it, so haven't a clue, Jeremy.
I actually,
but I will have some more beer since I'm
good. No, this was extremely compelling and very interesting, and sadly, concomitant with experiences that I've had while I was in graduate school, after I left graduate school, and in talking to a lot of my colleagues. And I would suggest that one thing that we can all do is, when we get our doctoral consortium mentees, all of you have doctoral consortium mentees, right? Pay attention to them, no matter what their gender is, and help them.
Could I just say that certainly in the UK, the problem is much more serious than you suggest. In fact, it's not just capable of being addressed by the community. The falling rules in computer science for women across the country is fairly staggering. So there are fewer and fewer women coming through, and we're even seeing, let alone being able to promote.
Actually, in the US, the percentage of women has dropped too. In every other field of science and engineering, the number of women is slowly, but it's increasing. And in computer science, it peaked in the late 90s and has begun to drop back down.
Yeah, I was hoping there would be, I could say something like Maria, like I disagree, but anyway, I strongly agree with all the stuff you said about women, well, gender schema and all that. In fact, every time I attend selection committee, I notice that men are just judged on promise and on who their advisor is and who is prepared to say, this guy is a genius, and women are judged on what they've done. And that's how it is. One thing that I disagree about, though, is that women don't like Block's World. I love Block's World.
But that's why I have two theories.
Yeah, I haven't solved it. The non-optimal problem is trivial. The optimal problem, optimal Block's World planning, is non-trivial, as Dana has shown, and we still don't have a heuristic that works well. And if we could, yeah, anyway. Right.
Martha, we should look at all parameters. It looks like race might be an issue as well.
Absolutely.
I don't know about left-handers. How many people are left-handed?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, the literature that I referred to, the gender schema literature, is actually literature on the experience of a minority in a majority-dominated field, and a lot of it transfers to race, sexual orientation, and so on.
I just want to ask if your talk implies that next time we have a blind review.
Yes.
Yeah.
That wasn't very strong.
Let me repeat his question. He wants to know if my talk implies that next time we have a blind review.
Even not blind, we'll all sign it brown.
What about more affirmative action, like, I don't like that. Prizes for women, something for women. Blind review is enough. Oh, that counts. I mean, even if we all come, what? I don't know. You must create something.
First of all, let me say that I promise I will put the toilet seat down. I have two serious things to mention. How many people here read Scientific America, I think it was 2 or 3 months back, where they were talking about the difference between male and female in terms of the thinking and the mind? They had some extremely bizarre, is one way to put it, another is interesting and revealing experiments that were discussed there, such as they gave toys to infant chimpanzees in a cage of different types, like dolls versus trucks. And inevitably, the female chimpanzees played with the dolls, and the male chimpanzees played with the trucks. Amazing experiments, which to me, the point I'm trying to make is that there is, in my opinion, a difference between men and women, at least at the youngest age, and I think it develops. The second point I want to make is that at least in the application areas, which is one reason that I'm here today, is because we're in the applications. The applications that we are working on is dominated by women. And when we look around the table in the conferences or in the meetings that we go to, the majority of the people are women, not men. In the application, not in the scientific area.
Okay, I'm out of time, but I'm going to have to answer very quickly just your first point. the jury is completely out. There may or may not be innate differences in men and women. There are some studies, the studies aren't very clear. What tends to happen is that people focus on very, very small known innate differences, apply them to all women, and ignore the wealth of data that's known about implicit bias and evaluation schema. So I'm all in favor of studies. I mean, I'm no scientist at heart. I'm all in favor of studies that look at the differences, if there are any, between men and women. But I think it's just way too easy to go down what's known. You know, men do mental rotation better than women. Women learn it.
I absolutely agree. I agree with you.
Okay, I just had to say that.
So now the 6 of the plaintiffs also going to be here, and there were questions that you had earlier. You can bring them back. We have about 13 minutes by Sam's watch, and you can bring up other questions, and then we will end this thing. So there are lots of other questions I know you guys wanted to ask. Bring it up.
I don't know if I have a question really. I have some experiences that I had at various points, and they all relate to the image of the field in general. So the first is when I went to India and I met my professors there, and these are professors who have been graduated like 20 years back or 15 years back, and I told them, you know, I'm doing AI planning. They had this nice smirk on their face. Oh, you're doing AI planning what? And then I told them, you know, the malcompletion process. Oh, okay, say OR. Then we realize that you are doing something meaningful. Otherwise, you know, you just make claims and don't do anything. So that's first, and then this relates to, I guess, AI in general. But then looking at AAA, Dan had the comment that 10% papers are planning. But in general, I interacted with people. So I talked to, you know, any grad student who is working in the cool area of learning or any other area, and I said, I understood what he was doing, if not necessarily all what he was doing, but the major area. But I told him, I'm looking at planning techniques. Many of those people didn't have any idea what I was talking about. Or look at courses that are taught in the various universities, and many of those courses will not touch planning or will touch planning extremely briefly. I don't know why that is, but I guess we have to think about that. And finally, coming back to jobs, in AAA we have these industrial booths, and I just had a quick survey of all the booths, you know, asking them what kind of people they're looking for in general, and they were all looking for machine learning people, and I guess none of them were looking for a planning or an MDB researcher. Just some comments. Thanks.
So one comment I have about the last point is, so perhaps we should think about doing machine learning for planning, which is a largely neglected area that I think has a lot of promise.
Okay. It seems to me that most of the problems that you addressed are not specific to this field. They are common to all areas of AI. Of course, the problem raised by Marta are even broader. And going back to the technical problems that were raised by maybe Dan and Craig, I'm glad that this field and our conference moved from APES to ICAPS. But I think that the move is not finished yet. We have to go even further. Several of you stressed, and the other speakers stressed, the issue of application-oriented work and applied research. I think the issue is not applied versus pure research. The issue is that of the relevance of the planning problem one works on. And in my view, there is no such a thing as a relevant planning problem. There are many, many different problems. And we have to address them through a broad set of techniques. Not just the techniques that we have been mainly focusing on the domain independent planning field. Maybe we should drop domain independent, from the perspective of our community, and look at planning through various kinds of techniques and enrich the set of techniques, of relevant techniques and problems that we may be addressing. And a final point, I fully agree with Marta, but maybe I would like to add another point, that cross-breeding from the scientific point of view can be a lot of good to our community. We should hire students from economics, from mathematics, from control theory, from other areas of research that may look at planning problem where one has to reason about actions from different perspectives than the traditional techniques that we have been developing.
I'd like to comment on the least point about the domain-specific planning, which is one of the things that always surprised me when you look at many applications, people criticize them and they say, well, you know, that's a very specific technique to that application. But I think one of the things that happens in a lot of applications is that, well, you end up with a more specific technique because you can do it more efficiently or there's certain characteristics of the problem. And one thing that very few people have actually looked at is the problem of taking, you know, general techniques and then automatically specializing into specific applications. So I think it's another area that's worth exploring.
Mazum, I just want to let you know that Honeywell has enough learning people and we're looking for planning.
So one of the things that struck me in the Festivus here is that I think the first time I went to AIPS, it was 95 or 96, was an invited talk in Edinburgh. And I remember that we hit a certain point where there was the debate between applications and theory. And it might have been Dave Smith who said, "Oh brother," and then we walked out after about 10 minutes of that debate. And the comment was, "Oh, here we go again," right? So, and that's almost 10 years ago. Now, if I look at where the field is now, I do some stuff in planning, but I can be half of an outsider, but the field has made tremendous progress, right? We have a lot less, there's a lot less papers on Blacksburg, a lot more on applications. The people who were on the side who were doing Blacksburg, I think Dave was one of those, much more on the application side. So if I look at the field has made tremendous progress in the last 10 years. So one thing I can ask myself is, why am I sitting here like I was 10 years ago hearing the lament? So maybe my lament is about the Festivus at one level. Why? Is it really useful kind of each year to have a lament about kind of the state of the field? Or the other thing that you can do is to say, gee, here are all these cool new frontiers to go into. Have a Festivus where people are giving 5-minute presentations about the exciting new directions that they're going. It seems like there's so many opportunities for the field and so many directions that you can grow into.
I'm one of those scruffy application guys, and you know, I came to this conference to learn, and I see that, you know, there's been I mean, there are lots of nice techniques that are very relevant to the kind of application work that I do, and on the other hand, if I look at the proceedings and I think of writing a paper, I would always say it's a waste of time. There's just no way that such a paper about an application would get accepted. And so, you know, it's so nice to hear that, you know, application papers perhaps should be accepted, and so maybe we'll give that a try. But it's different when you look at the proceedings, when you actually sort of hear the people saying, "Oh, we'd like to know more about some of the problems that you face in the application." So that was very nice.
I think we need an affirmative action policy
for that. Really, if you want to respond. So I do have one comment regarding the applications thing. Not so much about accepting more papers, which I'm sure all of you guys can do it. But in terms of something that I think was brought up earlier, I think Dana was saying it. Not all of us are going to be doing 24-hour jobs on specific application projects, okay? And there's an incredible amount of work to understand a true application area. And I remember two of the neatest things that happened in the planning community is one guy was standing there actually did a series of papers on explaining how the problems of importance to NASA can actually be made, can actually be tackled by the planning community. I mean, you know, the papers that Dave Smith wrote and the kinds of talks he gave. For example, I think there's a great talk that he gave in summer school, I understand, on the top 10 reasons why NASA can't use your planner. And, you know, and then of course people are working on some of the things. And I just think that sort of work needs to be appreciated in the community. I think Sylvie Thibault also wrote a domain and then gave information about the domain. You know, I think there are two different issues. One is getting more application papers published, but the other thing is getting more people to solve problems that are of use to real problems that actually are existing. And for that, you know, the kind of work that Dave did or Sylvia did, you know, needs to be appreciated much more, and probably ICAPS should allow papers which describe the abstracted versions of these applications and what are the theoretical problems that are worth doing. You know, I know that one summer talk that he gave probably has lots of citations out there.
So I wanted to say one thing about that. When I was spending this week sort of querying people about the application stuff, it became clear to me that there was a similar problem with the applied research as there is to the lack of women in the field, and that's the lack of role models. I had at least 2 people say, oh, well, I didn't want to submit my applied paper because I didn't think it was going to get in. Because they look at the proceedings and they look at how few papers have gotten in, and they assume there's going to be an triple AI massacre-like event that's going to happen. So we have a chicken and egg problem, and something's going to have to bootstrap it. And maybe Pat's right. We need an affirmative action. We need to get some models of good applied papers through now in order to encourage people to come later.
I'd just like to, sorry. Amadeus, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm trying to refine something.
So I just want to come back to this question of what we want from our conference, because clearly there's a lot of feeling that we ought to be widening the scope of papers that we accept, and Dave has said that he thinks that we should be allowing more or less well worked out work into the conference, which I don't necessarily disagree with. But I do think that we do have some tensions here, because we want this conference to be a high quality conference that's representative of our field. That means we need to get more submissions in if we want to accept more papers, but we've still got to keep our percentage of accepted papers down. I don't think we can go higher than about 35% if we want our conference to be respected. So we've got to look at a lot of issues about how we can balance all of these things to achieve everything that we're saying that we want to do.
I need to stop. Sorry guys, we apparently have to actually for once in our life show that we can execute a plan and end on time. Oh, we got a last minute reprieve of 5 minutes, so continue talking.
So this notion that we have... Wait.
Go ahead.
For like 5 speakers to say something.
It is clear that we don't have... There is another circle that we have to encourage. That is the fact that somebody refine with respect to what we are able to do, saying, listen, you're able to do here, but absolutely you are not capturing this problem. I should say that, for example, I'm very often very critical with NASA papers because they are, this abstract description of what their wonderful architecture with no technical content. I should say that I have to underscore that, for example, the talk by John Bresina, as I said to him, and Harry Johnson this morning, at the end, they pointed out, for example, open problems. And they make an effort to understand, to show to us what they are actually using, it was pretty clear, and where are the limitations of our current techniques. And this is what we need. And we need furtherly, maybe from other fields. The problem that the space, even if I like it a lot, is a niche somehow. So we should be a little bit tolerant with respect to enlarging, with respect to similar talk from other application domains. How to do it is another issue, maybe, it requires a little bit of investment.
I was just going to say one other thing on the same line, and that is one of the things that makes some of the, in Craig Noblock's, the left-hand side papers so easy to accept, if you've got something on a new technology or what have you, is you could look at the paper and relatively quickly determine what the contribution of the paper is, and exactly what you expect to learn by reading it. And the problem with many of the application papers that I've read is that it's hard to really learn much from the paper. It's hard to look at the paper and figure out what it is I'm going to learn, why I should be motivated to do that, except for, gee, they built a successful application to such and such. And it seems like that's a useful takeaway, but the really useful takeaway, as was just said, is exactly what the open problems are, or exactly what the specific techniques that were necessary, or what the surprises were, or what have you. And so I think if people can put more of that into their application papers, it will be accepted without quotas.
I just want to say one thing, which is that at the NIH, the National Institutes on Health these days, they've stopped distinguishing between applied research and basic research as the only two categories. And they have a third category called use-inspired research. And the idea, as I understand it from an AI perspective, is, I'm building a system. In my lab, we happen to work on assistive technology for people with cognitive impairment. Well, in order to do that, we have to model certain things in an efficient way. And those modeling needs then drive my students to go off and do research, say, on temporal reasoning, but where the questions that they're addressing in temporal reasoning are directly motivated by the kind of things we need to do in the applied work. And so I think of this as use-inspired research. I think if we can do more of that and have less of this chasm between applied and basic research, we'll all be better off.
Just wanted to respond to something earlier. I would like to think that this is a respected conference, not because we have 35% acceptance rate, but because we have good papers. And that if all of the papers are good, then by God, we should accept all of them.
So I was going to get up here, and I was going to start rebutting the various people who were whining about where the applications papers, but I've decided not to do that. Instead, I'm going to ask all of the people who are saying, I can't understand how to make use of the techniques that you did in your application. The applications are what these planning techniques are all about. So why isn't it that I can't write a paper in which I say, I have validated the theoretical work that you've done, and I've used it to make my application work. I didn't invent anything new, but I told you that what you did was useful. Why can't I write such a paper?
So we'll be thinking about that question of Jeremy and various other questions that came up in this 1 hour, 15 minutes as we get onto the bus and go before getting drunk. I want to take this opportunity to actually again thank the brave souls who actually stood up here and foolishly agreed to let me talk them into it. And also, especially thanks to the organizers who, my God, are so darn naive that they allowed me to do this. And I said, I'm going to change my clothes and start running any minute now. And as I said again, please understand that the questions that came up here do not necessarily mean at all that the planning is not a great community. In fact, as somebody else is saying, we should start losing this idea about we should have enough denominators so that we would be considered an acceptable conference. We are currently, the planning community has come to a point where only people who care about planning are actually doing planning. And unfortunately, we can't write bad papers. So unless we pay each other to write bad papers, we cannot have very large denominators. So that should be another thing. And I think questioning the status quo is always a good thing. And finally, the last point for all the graduate students and people here, life without planning graphs is much worse than life with them. So we still have something to look forward to. Okay. And I really like to thank Sam Steele for actually making sure that we get done exactly on time. And Mark Tyson, who will actually videotape these things so I can blackmail all the people. Buses start